Cool. All right. Well, welcome to the first edition of kind of the monthly dev call. This is going to be our new time slot for the foreseeable future. It's a little bit of a experiment to see if we can maybe not have Jim calling in at 7 o'clock and things like that, and get some more SmartThings people in here. So if this doesn't work out, we may move back to 5. We haven't really, like I said, it's kind of an experiment at this point. So we'll kind of see how it goes, and we'll keep you guys updated. So for the foreseeable future, though, we'll be doing this. So like we kind of talked about, I'm just going to give an overview of kind of the new format. We want to keep it kind of more educational. Talk about some of the things that maybe we know inside of SmartThings. Like today we're going to talk about best practices. Some of the things that we've learned, some of the things that might not, in the SmartThings world, so to speak, might be more, better for you to do, specifically when it comes to SmartThings. There's some cases of that in here that we talked about that for some reason, maybe in SmartThings, XYZ thing is slower or faster, and that might not be true anywhere else, or a lot of places. So just some best practices when you're working within SmartThings. So that's how we're going to kind of keep it. I will go ahead and share a slide deck. We'll go over it. Jim and I are going to kind of be going back and forth on this. I'll kind of take the lead a little bit, and Jim can add in his extra points as we go along. And like I said, we will have a Q&A. So let me go ahead and start the presentation here, and I will get you the where to go here. There it is. Anyone? Come on. And there it is in the chat. So if you want to click on that link in the chat, you'll be able to go there and ask some questions based on either the presentation or some questions that you have around if we didn't mention something in the presentation, and you're like, hey, I came across this, what's kind of the best way to do this when I'm coding in SmartThings. Definitely take a look at that, and we will go ahead and I will share my screen here so that you guys can all see there we go. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Cool. I'm going to go ahead and, all right, can everyone still see that? Yep. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and get started. And of course, I started on slide 4. So here it is. Again, up at the top is that link you can go to. I put it in the Zoom. Go ahead and start asking questions as we go along. Again, this is the Smart App and Device Handler best practices. So let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, when you think of code, it should be readable to anyone. There's a couple reasons we want this. We are a open source community, right? So you can be sharing code with people. You can also be sharing code with us through submissions or some other, maybe some other way. And what we want is for even people who may not be as technically inclined, especially in the open source area, to be able to read your code. It should be clear. Don't repeat yourself. So that's kind of a big thing. If you find yourself kind of copying and pasting all the time, create a method that, gets that same data over and over again, right? Create that method that you can call over and over again throughout your code, so that you don't have this big, long, conflated code with the same exact stuff in it. Methods should kind of serve a single purpose. So if you have a method that's, parsing some JSON, then turning on a light and setting a thermostat, you should probably just have a method that parses that JSON and then takes action off of that JSON in other kind of helper methods outside of that. Comments are really nice. Comments, we get a lot of submissions here at SmartThings where the author obviously knows what everything is doing, and it's not that the author is trying to do anything out of the bounds of what they're supposed to or allowed to do, but we get things without comments, and it makes it hard for us to understand maybe if someone is doing something that's a little bit outside of the best practices. Maybe there's a reason for doing that, but they don't provide a comment that allows us to know why they chose to do it in such a way. And not that we would turn it down, but if we don't know why you did it that way, then we may just reject the submission based on that kind of unknowing, so to speak. And then don't keep around unused code. So if you have these big code blocks in your code that are old, stale code that maybe you're just keeping around for, cataloging purposes, get rid of that when you submit to us. And it also makes it easy when you share code on the community to kind of get rid of that. So if you're using GitHub or something along those lines, you can definitely maybe keep a development branch with that information in it, and then remove that stuff when you merge it up to master or production branch or whatever you decide to share with the community. And then the last one is kind of self-explanatory, but anywhere, whether you're submitting to us or whether you are sharing on the community, your code should not be talking about other people in bad ways, and it should also not have any language in it that might offend people. So keep it readable, keep it simple, and let us know what you're doing. Let everyone know what you're doing, as far as you using comments and things like that. So this one here is kind of a really important slide. It's the kind of handle all runtime outcomes. And what we kind of mean by this is, make sure that when you're making and writing code, that you kind of think through what could possibly come up that would cause your code to run into any sort of exception. So first and foremost, null pointer exceptions. They are quite honestly the largest error that we receive on our platform. On average, we say 80,000 per day. That is a lot. It's an exorbitant amount, and we would love to see that come down. And we'll probably be talking internally about how we can, start to do some of that stuff. But as you're coding, keep in mind that null pointer exceptions can happen really easily. So if you're expecting that maybe sometimes some sort of list could be empty, just put a safe navigator over that. We've talked about that down at the bottom. There's a code example there. It's pretty simple. Groovy provides a really, really awesome safe navigator operator that allows you to basically say, hey, straight in line, no ifs, thens, that's, whatevers. You can basically just put a question mark after whatever content is there. So for instance, in this LAN event example, maybe the headers and the content type, maybe those might be empty. So if you just put a question mark after each one of those, if they are empty, it's not going to throw an exception. So that'll just obviously whatever you were trying to do based on that won't happen, but it won't throw an exception. And then what you can do after that is actually catch that exception and say, hey, okay, maybe I'll try this again in 5 minutes to see if I can get the information that I needed. If else and switch statements, again, those aren't necessarily bulletproof. what you can do basically is say, hey, I have this if statement or a switch statement. Switch is really nice because it does provide kind of that default case statement where it says, hey, if none of these match, then here's the default. Maybe you log and say nothing's matched or whatever. But in an if statement, just provide that last kind of standing else statement to say, hey, if none of this matches, then go ahead and, send a notification to the user that says this failed or, something along those lines. And then make sure that when you are calling methods that whatever parameter that you're sending into that method is expected by that method. So if you're sending a number, make sure that you're not trying to, set something that can't be, transposed from a number into a blah, blah, just make sure that everything can be expected within that method. And then we shouldn't run into any sort of kind of error types. Jim, did you have anything to add on those two slides?
I do not.
Awesome, cool. On to the next one. This is kind of a funny thing, kind of tell the truth. But basically, it's working with truths in your code. Groovy does some really weird. Not weird, I should say, but interesting things with truths, and they're pretty powerful, but they can cause some problems if you're not careful about how you look at things. So just to start, empty strings are considered false, but non-empty strings are considered true. Again, with maps, empty maps are considered false, non-empty maps are considered true. And then this is where a lot of people get kind of caught up in the truth section of Groovy, is that 0 is considered false and non-zero numbers are considered true. So what can happen is you can be expecting something like, hey, in this case, if you have if not level, right? So if you send that level in there as 0, that first if is actually going to evaluate as true, and it's going to return false. So it's this weird kind of gotcha that can basically make what you think is false or a true value as returned as false. So keep that in mind. We have an example there on the right hand side to kind of show you how to get around that. That might not use kind of this anti-true statement. Just keep that in mind. Again, basically anything that's empty or 0 would be considered false. So keep that in mind, and you won't have any gotchas in your code. Next one is state. So this again is a pretty important one to us, and when I say recently, within the last couple months, we have limited the state. We've limited state to 100 characters, 100,000 characters. Sorry, and the reason for this is we found a lot of people were doing one of two things. They were either purposefully using state as kind of a database to store lots and lots and lots of historical data. And not that that's a huge problem to store data in state. I mean, that is what it's for. But, we had some people who were storing as close as 1 million characters in state. And it was not being nice to our databases. So keep in mind that one, it is limited to 100 characters or 100,000 characters. And you should be kind of looking at state to make sure that it's not going to go over. So in a lot of cases, it's not going to go over. Maybe you're using state to store some sort of quote unquote state of your app. So, state could be true or false, depending on whether a light's on or off, something like that, or depending on whether you're in a certain mode. So it's easier for you to kind of reference what your app should be doing based on a quote unquote state of your app. So things like that are definitely, you're probably never going to go over because you're just changing the state back and forth and replacing the actual content in the state. But if you believe that your state might reach 100,000 characters, you should be checking that state to make sure that it is not over a certain number of characters, and do a little bit of kind of thinking about how your state would grow. And if you're storing, on-off values for the last, 7 days, maybe you only need 500 characters. But if you're storing, the last 2 JSON queries, maybe you need 5,000 characters, something along those lines. And then we have an example down here of kind of the unbounded state. And this is kind of what we saw a lot, where people were inadvertently just storing values in state and never kind of clearing it or checking to see whether it was actually whether it was growing unbounded. So on the left-hand side, we basically just have a value being put into a map here, or a list. And then on the right-hand side, we just have an example to say, hey, if you think that it's going to grow kind of unboundedly, just go ahead and check that. And then when you check it and it might be greater than 500 characters, then go ahead and maybe just drop the first 2 values. And put the next value in there. Jim, I know you worked on this too. Did I cover everything? Is there anything else you wanted to talk about on state?
The only a tricky point is that if you exceed the limit, there will be an exception thrown. But because state, and not atomic state, but just regular state, is only written upon completion of the app, you won't be able to handle that exception in your app. So that's part of the motive for, you can check the size, but just if you try to catch that exception and handle it within the execution, it'll never get hit.
And that's because the state is saved on completion of execution, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to clarify why that happened. And atomic state is saved immediately, essentially, right?
You can think of it that way, yes.
Okay, yeah. In layman's terms, in simple terms, it's saved quote unquote immediately. So that's kind of state. Again, don't really use it as a database. If you are developing some sort of system that requires a database, create your own. Unfortunately, we don't really have the functionality to allow a large database to be stored per app. So we have developers like SmartThings, who they've actually recently announced that they're going to have V6, and they're starting to kind of offload their databases into their own systems, and that's kind of the best practice here if you need long-term standing data. Okay, so web services. This is a really important one, especially because we just really want everyone involved, whoever's touching the code, we want them to know what these requests are doing. So, you can have external requests that either request data or put data somewhere. Especially for requests that are taking data from within SmartThings and putting them somewhere else. Not that is inherently bad. I mean, that's what we're here for. We're here to extend, allow people to extend the platform. And sometimes it is necessary to extend beyond the SmartThings platform and go into other kind of third-party services that would then do something else really awesome on top of our platform. So when that's the case, what we really want to know is what that data is doing, why you're sending it out, and then also what that third party's privacy policy is. And so that's for us internally, but I would say that also for sharing code in the open source community, you should definitely always document that as well. It's always good for someone to be able to see why and where you're sending their data. And if they want to go to that third party and view the privacy policy and see what that third party does with the data, then they should be able to do that. Also document all endpoints. Again, very similar to kind of the HTTP request, but we should know what you're doing with those endpoints, whether it's a customer, in the open source community, and a consumer of your app, or whether it's us on the submission side. We should know what you're doing with your endpoints. So, if you have an endpoint called collect all data, we should know what that endpoint is meant for, right? That way we don't assume the worst. And if we see an endpoint called collect all data and you don't have any kind of backing up on what you're doing with that information and what that endpoint is actually doing, then we run into some problems where we basically just assume the worst and we might just deny it based on that fact. Also, when parsing long HTTP requests, now this has a little bit of internal conflict among some of the people internally. So I'm going to preface it with, this is things that I have noticed in my own kind of working with developers as well as writing my own stuff, is that if you have a really, really long, and I'm talking probably maybe 5 or 6 more, maybe 3, but something that is a really long if-else statement. I have found that to cut down execution limits, or cut down on hitting that and cut down the execution time of your app, that using a switch statement instead of an if-else statement has worked wonders for me. There are some other cases on the community that I've worked with where this has also improved it. So I'm going to preface this with, this is what we're going to say at the moment. But if you have some evidence that that's not the case, please let us know and we will correct ourselves. But for now, the data that I have is basically, using a switch statement instead of a if-else statement is the better way to go. If you have a really long, you're parsing, 2,000, 4,000 characters of JSON data, lots of data, use a switch statement. And next is make sure that when you are handling the request that you use a try catch. This way you can handle all kind of the normal error cases, the 401s, 404s of the world, and any other errors. You can handle all sorts of internal errors into the app, but just make sure you're handling those. And then the nice thing is, again, you can say things like, hey, I got a timeout here. I'm going to go ahead and, wait 5 minutes and try again. Maybe I only call it every 30 minutes, but because I got an error here, I'm going to schedule it again for 5 minutes from now to see if I can get that back. Really nice to kind of, sometimes things happen. Sometimes data doesn't come across the internet. I know it's hard to believe, but when that does happen, you can catch it and, try it again, things like that. On to scheduling. Scheduling is super important. We recently, within the last 3 or 4 months release ticker. It is ticking along, so to speak, and we just have some general kind of gotchas that might hinder kind of the scheduling of the smart apps. One is to avoid run-in chaining. The big reason for this is not that run-in is inherently flawed, but we schedule millions of schedules every day, and run-in has no fail-safe. So if we miss that schedule for whatever reason, and we would love to say we're at 100%, but that's a hard number to get to. So if we do miss a run-in schedule, it doesn't have any kind of fail-safe to it. Whereas any of our kind of cron schedules, which are the actual schedule function where you can put a cron expression in there, or any of the schedule or run every 5 minutes, run every 10 minutes, things like that. Any of those kind of helper methods, APIs that we have available, those work on cron. So those are able to kind of reboot on the back end, and we're able to say, hey, we missed this one. When the next one comes along, it's going to run still. And it allows your app to be much more robust in its scheduling. So where possible, always use cron. And the nice thing about cron is you can actually schedule things for a specific date and time. So, where possible, like I said, use cron over run-in, but definitely don't run-in, chain run-in. So it should never be run in 5 minutes over and over and over again. If you need every 5 minute schedule, use our helper API, things like that. Most smart apps we have found don't have to run very often. We kind of have this kind of thing where we always want to make sure that we have the latest and greatest data. But sometimes when you're, for instance, you're kind of looking at let's say a moisture sensor. We find that sometimes people not only subscribe to the event, but they also schedule something to look at it every minute. And not to say that you're not allowed to say, hey, subscribe to the event and check the device on an interval, but maybe you don't need to check that device every minute. The event should get you that real-time data on the event change. But maybe if you just wanted to make extra sure, you could schedule something for every half hour instead of every 1 minute. So things like that. So just kind of think carefully about how you schedule kind of smart apps to run over and over again. If it doesn't need to run every minute, don't run it every minute. Maybe run it every 10 minutes, things like that. And then also if a schedule, and this is kind of important with cron schedules, is if a schedule is only used kind of under certain circumstances, like let's say you have an app that runs every 5 minutes, but you only want that to run when you're in a certain mode. If you're not in that mode, go ahead and cancel that schedule. And only reschedule that schedule when you're back in that mode. So that way we don't have these extraneous schedules out there. And we do find a lot that when people are developing that they have these schedules that are always running, and maybe they actually only need to run for like 2 hours out of the day. So things like that, again, it's just thinking through kind of how to carefully schedule your app and not have it be running when it's not supposed to be, how to make your scheduling more kind of fail-proof, so to speak, by using cron, things like that. Jim, you're pretty up on scheduling. Did I get it all?
Yeah, I think those are the important points. There's a lot more in the docs,
Yep.
and regarding like the cron stuff, prefer cron for recurring schedules. Tie into that, understand and test your cron expression. We see a lot of people trying to execute something every 5 minutes or something, and they end up with an expression that's executing every second.
Right.
Trying to. So That would be the other thing to watch out for.
Or we'll see someone who writes a cron expression that for every 5th minute, run every second within that minute. Things like that. So good point, Jim. So again, scheduling is really important, and we have a giant scheduling architecture. So when you think more thoughtfully about how you're scheduling, it's going to work out better for you in the long run. And next is our kind of security considerations. So these are kind of points of just, hey, don't be looking at data that you shouldn't be, look for data that you say you're looking at, things like that. So subscriptions, they should be very specific. So one, overly broad subscriptions can cause unneeded stress on the platform by, kind of subscribing to these events that you're never going to look at anyways. And also, it also creates this kind of micro security concern where you might say you're looking at, let's say you're looking at mode, which is a kind of a location event, right? You could be looking at mode, but if you only subscribe to the location and every event within that location, you're getting a lot more data on top of that than just mode. So be very specific in your subscriptions. And if you're not specific in your subscriptions, for some reason you do need all the location events, like we said before, put a comment in there and say, hey, I need every location event because I'm doing XYZ thing with them. And here's why I need them. Again, kind of similar, but subscriptions should be clear. When you subscribe to something, it should be clear why you're using that. And also try not to use variables for subscriptions. Subscribing directly to the event is kind of the preferred method. Granted, you can kind of inject a variable in there, and that's not necessarily against the rules. But again, let us know why you're doing that. We don't really see that many use cases for something like that. So at the moment, we would really like to just have you subscribe to the very specific event. But again, if you need to do it, let us know why. But if you don't, we're probably going to go ahead and deny that. And again, even on the open source side of things, it's just better to let everyone know involved, whether they're looking at the code to, add on top of it and add to your open source project, or whether they're a consumer of your open source project. Everyone involved should be able to clearly see what you're doing. And then this one is do not hard code SMS notifications. So we don't want someone to have an input for, say, someone's number to send them SMS notifications, and then right below that they have another SMS notification that sends it to their telephone with a whole bunch of other data or whatever. So don't hard code SMS notifications. That number should always be dynamic, and the only input should be from the consumer or user of that of said app. So that's for security considerations. Up next, performance suggestions. So don't use busy loops. Busy loops are the crux of kind of bad performance on some apps we've seen. If you need to kind of delay execution for some reason, maybe you're waiting for a response to come back, or you just need to wait to see if something has changed, just go ahead and schedule that app to run when you need it to. So if you need to wait a minute, don't try and wait a minute. One, you'll reach the execution timeout. But if you need to wait a certain number of time to see if something has changed, go ahead and just say, hey, run again in 30 seconds or run again in 20 seconds or something like that. Don't use synchronized. So synchronized is kind of interesting. There are a lot of places where it can provide some benefit, but in the SmartThings environment, it doesn't. So we have a big cluster of these servers basically in the cloud that your app can choose to run on. If you use Synchronize, you could be running X app on server number 1 and then another app on server number 10. And that Synchronized provides you with no value, but it 100% incurs more overhead on the system. So don't use Synchronized because it's like a 1 in a million chance that you're actually going to see any benefit from it. So just don't use it. Not a best practice at all. And then again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the HTTP requests. Right now, I'm recommending that you use switch statements instead of long nested if-else statements. But that's still up for debate a little bit. So let us know if you have some empirical data that could help us understand. I will be looking into this a little bit more, and if I find it to be false, I will correct it.
I think, Tim, regardless of performance, I think that we can fairly confidently say that a switch statement for a large set of conditions offers better readability. I don't think we're discussing if it's possibly worse performance, because I don't see that happening. Actually, I'm running some benchmarks now, but the performance considerations aside, it's a preferred programming practice to use switch for a large number of options.
There we go. So use it. It'll be easier for us to read, and we'll like you better. So that kind of concludes our slide deck today. It is 2:40. Wow, we did good. So just so you guys know, I will be. We are in the process of bringing out a new blog for developers, and we will be following up this with a blog when that comes. Should be in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and I will share this slide deck with everyone. I will also be posting this call online on YouTube, so we'll be sharing that. So we'll share the YouTube link, and we'll share a link to this doc as well. In the meantime, if you want it, if you want this slide deck, go ahead and reach out to me. I'm on the community. I'm at Slagle, SLAGLE. Reach out to me on the community, and I can definitely get it to you. I have no problem sharing it with you guys. So if you want it, let me know. Again, this was kind of derived from our online already there code review guidelines. So there's the link. If you want to screenshot it or whatever, go ahead. And we will go ahead and move on to the questions. 2 from Patrick. Let's see here. Why do none of the SmartThings published DTH and essays have no comments or attributions? I don't know.
Not as we do.
What'd you say, Jim?
As we say, not as we do.
Right.
I think that's the point.
Yep.
Yeah, we had, as we were going through and working with engineering on these best practices, that was one of the things we kept saying is, we don't necessarily argue with what we're saying, but obviously we have our own code base, which doesn't adhere to some of these things. And I can't really, excuse that other than just saying, that's the way it is. What we are hopeful for is that as we get these out there and stuff, this becomes some low-hanging fruit, not only for ourselves to clean up, but also through open source contributions, which might be hard because you might not know intent and stuff like that. But we've evolved over time, and some of the code hasn't evolved with us.
Right. Yeah, I think we are getting better at that, but definitely a good point, Patrick. And I think we're definitely trying to be better in that area for sure. Okay, and then number 2, any chance exceptions like going over state can be stored as events. I don't know that that's not a possibility, but I think this is maybe the first time I've had this suggestion, and it's not a bad one by any means. Jim, do you have any reason why we should say on this call that absolutely can't happen?
I don't know enough. I think the crux of the issue that we're getting at is that we need transparency and visibility into exceptions and all sorts of things. And I mean, that is something that's on people's radar. I know there's a couple developers on this call who've actually at SmartThings who may be interested in that, and they can chime in if they want. But I don't know if there's some temporary possibility of sort of co-opting an event for that, but that might have a lot of negative downstream consequences that we don't want to bite off.
Right. So let's definitely a good idea, Patrick. And let's go ahead and maybe table that for now. And like Jim said, there are some of our engineers on the call right now. So maybe we can follow up with those guys and see what they say. But it's definitely a good idea. I do see the need for that because if you don't catch it while you're live logging, right, you'll never see it again. So that definitely makes it difficult. And yeah, so let's maybe follow up on that, and we'll see what we can find out internally. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. Does anyone else? So Patrick asked his 2 questions. Patrick, did you have any last questions, or anyone else? We can open it up to a small kind of live Q&A. If not, then we can kind of call it a day.
I think I can comment on the rate limiting question.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks, Vlad.
So I think it'd be a lot easier to display to the user that a rate limit is in place and that we're enforcing it, as opposed to making every rate limit event that occurs an event that the user can see. So, I mean, if we want like a short-term solution that would be probably easier to implement, that we could definitely go the route of, hey, this user has these end SmartApps, have a rate limit in place that's enforcing right now, and they may have like a user API rate limit in place that's also enforcing right now. So it wouldn't be quite as, I guess, live as your smart app is firing, but you could see that you are being rate limited in some way.
Okay. Yeah. Vlad, would it help if I just opened up a ticket for you to start investigating something like this?
You could open up a ticket for us to start investigating, prioritizing something like this.
Sure. Yeah. But just to get it on the radar. Okay, yeah. I'll go ahead and do that. And that way the conversation can keep going that's not here. So it can happen internally. So cool. Thanks, Vlad. I really appreciate that. Thank you for chiming in. Any last questions? Nope. Okay. Well, we really thank you guys for joining. We do appreciate your time and appreciate you joining. Again, we'll follow this up with a little bit of a blog post when we get the blog live, which should be 2 to 3 weeks. And then we'll go ahead and share the slides and the recording of this with you guys. And if you want the slides in the meantime, please let me know at Slagle on the community, SLAGLE, and I will be glad to send you the slide deck. So thanks again. Thanks for coming, everyone, and have a good day.